all of our citizens and residents. So, you know, I think it's so important that we really focus on this because, like I said, even I, who I think am generally sensitive to these issues, could overlook it. And you know, with that, I think I want to introduce our first speaker. That's Professor Najri Mathis Rutledge of South Texas College of Law, who's a great wealth of experience in the criminal law. In particular, prior to joining the Academy, she served as a prosecutor for Harris County, working on hundreds of cases across the spectrum of the criminal law. She also serves as an associate judge on the City of Houston Municipal Court. And she's going to share with us her thoughts on diversity within the criminal law.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Diversity discussions are usually difficult because people assume that it's a platform to label all people in extremes. Either you are active in the civil rights movement or you're a member of the KKK, without recognizing everyone in between. Bias impacts all of us, even me. I have been shocked and embarrassed by some of the results of implicit bias tests that I have taken. Now, although some of you may be feeling defensive or even skeptical when the topic of diversity in criminal justice comes up, I hope that you will be open to different perspectives. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen, which I just hope is going to be seamless, right? Wonderful. How many of you believe that our criminal justice system is wonderful and works fairly and effectively for all people? Now, we already know that the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts the poor, particularly poor people of color. I loved being a prosecutor for over 3.5 years. I've also enjoyed serving as an associate judge for the city for over 12 years. And despite the belief of some, I don't believe that there's some big conspiracy or that the police are in cahoots with prosecutors or judges to put Black and brown people in jail. I believe evil exists and that bad choices should have consequences. I also know that the war on drugs was actually a war on people, and it has resulted in a disruption of minority communities and families, armed invasions in people's homes by SWAT teams, and staggering incarceration rates. I know that diversity matters. We can't really discuss diversity within the criminal justice system without discussing one of the most important participants. Although minorities are overrepresented as defendants, they are underrepresented in positions of power, particularly as prosecutors and judges. Now, I recently Googled the words Texas and prosecutor, and here are the images that came up. The most important participant in the criminal justice system is not the victim of the crime or the accused or the defense attorney. Most people assume the most important person is the judge, but that simply is not true. The most powerful, important person is the prosecuting attorney. As Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson wrote in 1940, the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. His or her discretion is tremendous. While the prosecutor at his or her best is one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when acting from malice or other base motives, they are one of the worst. As prosecutor and criminal justice reform advocate Adam Foss explained, when we talk about criminal justice reform, we tend to complain, tweet, and protest about the police or sentencing laws or prisons, but we rarely talk about the prosecutor. How many of you know who your elected prosecutor is? How many know what they are doing and what they stand for? While a judge does have power and discretion to make important rulings, a good judge is a neutral referee. The judge does not decide who to investigate, arrest, or charge. The judge does not decide what the charges will be, the number of charges, whether the charge will be enhanced as a hate crime, or enhanced based on prior criminal convictions. In fact, a judge cannot even unilaterally dismiss a case. Cases are brought by prosecutors. As a prosecutor working intake, the police would call me to decide whether someone was going to jail or going home. During my very first week as a prosecutor, I made decisions that impacted people's lives for a lifetime. Even more concerning, I made decisions without having any insight into who those people were and if they needed help. Now, interestingly, if you're in the trenches as a prosecutor, you probably have a crushing caseload, a million things on your desk, victims and police officers calling you, and a series of dockets, trials, and motions. The opportunity to fight for crime victims is noble and stressful. I have been to crime scenes. I've met victims inside their homes. I've seen images that I can never forget. I've taken my own money for exhibits. I've given up weekends, gotten up early, and went to bed late, all because I believed in the work I was doing. I felt like I wore the white hat, despite the media sometimes telling me that I didn't. If you're currently working as a prosecutor, you probably feel anything but powerful, but you are. The only thing you needed to be given the vast discretion and responsibility you have was a law degree. One of the most important aspects of the criminal justice system is plea bargaining. Over 97% of all criminal cases result in plea bargains. Along with the power to plea comes that discretion to determine who will be given probation, sent to a specialized program, or go to jail. If a case is not indicted by a grand jury, it's the prosecutor who gets to decide whether to dismiss or represent the case. As a judge, I have to wait for the prosecutor to make a motion to dismiss a case unless there's a dispute about probable cause or evidence suppression. As I address diversity within criminal justice, I want to focus on the need for continued efforts towards diversity in the prosecutor's office. Oh, sorry. Now, this is a picture of a book, and I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay that I wrote from this anthology called Meeting at the Table, African American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community. As a student in Atlanta, I remember strolling with a date through the leafy campus of the historically Black college and university of Spelman College as we shared our hopes and our dreams. When I told my date my dream of becoming a prosecuting attorney, I was startled by his response. "So, you want to put Black men in jail?" He asked me in a very accusatory tone. In the heated debate that followed, I asked him about fighting for minority crime victims. I proudly became a prosecutor, not to put Black men in jail, but to prosecute crime in my community. Serving as a prosecuting attorney was one of my most proudest career choices. I believe I made big and small differences. Although I am disappointed by my companion's accusation that I wanted to somehow hurt my community, specifically Black men, in retrospect, I should not have been surprised. Minority prosecutors, especially Black prosecutors, are routinely accused of being a tool in a biased system by some and being too lenient when criminal justice reform is discussed by others. Nothing could be further from the truth. For the reality is, all prosecutors have valuable insight into the strengths and flaws of the system. Sadly, law students are losing interest in this honorable calling. 10 years ago, half of my criminal law students wanted to become prosecutors. Today, virtually all want to be defense attorneys, especially the minority law students. Interest in criminal justice reform through defense work has grown, but the same is not true for prosecution. The horrific instances of police brutality, such as George Floyd's case, and the issues of systemic racism and mass incarceration is only furthering their resolve. Now, I believe it's short-sighted to assume that defense attorneys alone can single-handedly reform criminal justice. There is no doubt that the defense bar makes a vital contribution. We need devoted lawyers on both sides of the process if we hope to ever have genuine criminal justice reform. Minority prosecutors matter to the criminal justice system, to criminal defendants, and to crime victims. But let me also be perfectly clear. Many white prosecutors are culturally competent and care very much about justice for all victims. But we should not underestimate the benefits of prosecution offices staffed to reflect the communities they serve. When many people think of prosecutors, they envision characters from television, generally older, distinguished white males wearing cheap dark suits. What is not on television, or the image that most people readily imagine, is a prosecutor who is a minority. This needs to change. Before becoming a law professor at South Texas College of Law, Houston, I was a prosecutor, and I was an image far from those seen on television cop shows. Vice President Kamala Harris's selection as President Joe Biden's running mate elevated the discussion of minority prosecutors. Harris's experience, which would have been seen as a tremendous asset a few decades ago, was routinely described as a liability. As one writer noted, the problem was not about Vice President Harris's record as a prosecutor, but that she was ever a prosecutor at all. Others have condemned her for failing to atone for sending people to jail, which is an odd demand for someone whose job it was to prosecute crime. Kamala is a cop became a repeated negative slogan stated by detractors. For a community that has a complicated relationship with law enforcement, that was akin to calling her untrustworthy. Of course, no prosecutor should be above reproach or criticism. However, when minority prosecutors are more harshly criticized, law students take note. In contrast, Senator Amy Klobuchar was not criticized as a prosecutor until much later in the process, and to a lesser extent. Many local prosecutors move on to very powerful positions as federal prosecutors, judges, or politicians. The message this is sending is that serving as a prosecutor could hurt future aspirations if you're a minority, while it may open doors for non minority students. Of course, every prosecutor should be held to the highest standard of ethics. However, similar to my days in college, there seems to be an increasing tendency to condemn minority prosecutors for their career choice instead of their conduct. The last report to study the number of elected prosecutors found that 95% of elected prosecutors are white, while just 1% are minority women. Now, several Black prosecutors have since been elected in major cities since the study was released. Unfortunately, they have also been subjected to death threats, harsh criticism, which focus more on the prosecutor's race than their record. I'm going to share a very hate-filled voicemail that Baltimore's elected prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, received. Now, I apologize in advance for the vitriolic tone and offensive language, but I think it's important that we hear it.
How dare you come to St. Louis and say you got the back of that lousy state's attorney, Kim Gardner? She is just like you. That's why, birds of a feather, that's what you are. You hate cops, you hate white people, you do everything you can to give all the blacks who are criminals every benefit of the doubt, and everybody else is suspect. Black lives only matter when a white person takes it. You blacks can kill each other all you want. In fact, I think that's the grand solution. We need to start driving around the ghettos and just dropping boxes of bullets on every street corner. Let them take each other out. Things were much better in this world, in this country, when everybody stayed in their own neighborhoods by dusk. There's only one thing worse than a fat, empowered black woman. That's a fat, empowered black woman who's got public reins in her hands. If we'd known you all were going to be this much trouble, we would have picked our own cotton.
As disgustingly racist as that was, Sadly, it's not the only incident towards elected prosecutors that revealed racist and misogynistic thought, or misogynoir, defined as misogynistic attitudes directed towards Black women specifically. These kind of racist attitudes cannot deter progress. We need more, not fewer, ethical individuals to work within criminal justice. Indeed, the community, particularly minority communities, should be concerned by the disappearance or the prospect of Black prosecutors and minority prosecutors disappearing altogether. Minority prosecutors bring an important perspective to their duties, a perspective that ideally helps bridge the many chasms between law enforcement and the public. Minority prosecutors also bring a sensitivity to bias within the system that can make a difference in how a case is viewed. Ideally, this should result in fairer outcomes. A minority prosecutor may also contribute to the message that the system cares about all crime victims, including minority crime victims. All victims ultimately want the same thing: to live safely in their communities. Some crime victims may be viewed as unsympathetic, but the assessment should not be based on a prosecutor's confusion about the victim's cultural norms. A prosecutor needs to be able to appreciate the victim's perspective and life experiences. There is significant value in having diverse perspectives in important decisions. Justice is simply much more complex than applying a criminal code. It requires an understanding and, yes, even an empathy for those caught up in the system. Justice Jackson also stated that, quote, a sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power. And the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. Empathy does not mean ignoring the law, but it does mean ensuring equal and fair justice for both victims and defendants. The stakes are high. Lack of cultural competence can negatively impact minority defendants. Consider a witness describing a defendant as having a braided hairstyle called cornrows, and the person arrested actually has a fade. Would a non-minority prosecutor pick up on the distinction, or would it be deemed irrelevant? The answer could have long-lasting implications. According to a 2017 study of the National Registry of Exonerations, innocent Blacks were 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder than innocent whites. Now, it bears repeating, there are non-minority prosecutors, including white prosecutors and defense attorneys, who care about justice and making the system better. But we should never underestimate the benefits from prosecution offices that reflect the true diversity of their communities. As a felony prosecutor, I remember a white prosecutor asking me to speak to a young Black victim who had been raped, who decided she didn't want to go forward with the charges. I had never worked with this prosecutor before, and I didn't know anything about the case, but the prosecutor recognized that having me in the room would add value. A prosecutor's office that does not include diversity will tend to reflect one segment of the community. When prosecutors are skeptical about a minority victim's behavior because it doesn't conform to the norm, the minority victim may be viewed as unsympathetic. For example, a statistically significant number of minority domestic violence victims choose not to prosecute. If a prosecutor is not culturally competent, the prosecutor may assume that the victim just wasted the government's time and she's weak. Minority prosecutors may understand that the victim does want help, but her fears about helping to place their minority partner in a system that is perceived as biased is a genuine fear. Minority prosecutors can make a positive difference in the criminal justice system in terms of both perception and power. When all minority lawyers in a criminal courtroom are limited to serving as defense attorneys, I believe it sends the wrong message that minorities do not believe in law and order or accountability, or are somehow not qualified for other important roles. The involvement of Black prosecutors lends credibility to a system where Blacks are frequently accused. According to the American Bar Association and the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, the actual job and duty of a prosecutor is a noble one, not to seek convictions, but to do and seek justice. It was that call to do and seek justice that inspired me to serve in an overworked, underpaid, yet personally fulfilling job. I believe one can be called to be a prosecutor the same way one can be called to be a defense attorney. We need both, working with integrity and honor in order to do justice. The potential to impact lives every day is substantial. I lament that so many of my students, minorities and non-minorities, fail to see the nobility of the calling and tend to conflate the problems of highly publicized police misconduct with the prosecutor's office. Not to say that some prosecutors haven't made really poor and bad decisions. Not to say that there are some people who have been complicit. But the negative view of prosecutors and how they are displayed still saddens me. I came across one article that blamed prosecutors for the problem of mass incarceration. Such a claim is oversimplistic and misleading. The good, dedicated people who do the hard work are often in the shadows. Criminal justice is complicated. Whether I'm a judge or a prosecutor, there are times when I feel like I'm just a spoke in a very large wheel. We don't know how to help people who need it or deal with mental health issues. Mistakes are made. But for me, serving as a prosecutor was an opportunity where I could make a positive difference. I would like to conclude with a brief clip from Adam Foss, a prosecutor and criminal justice reform advocate.
My third year of law school, I defended people accused of small street crimes, mostly mentally ill, mostly homeless, mostly drug addicted, all in need of help. They would come to us, and we would send them away without that help. They were in need of our assistance, but we weren't giving them any. Prosecuted, adjudged, and defended by people who knew nothing about them. The staggering inefficiency is what drove me to criminal justice work. The unfairness of it all made me want to be a defender. The power dynamic that I came to understand made me become a prosecutor.
The power to affect change does indeed begin with the prosecutor. So how do we move forward? One important impediment to students, particularly diverse students entering public service, is finances. We need more people to collaborate with groups dedicated to providing grants and scholarships for diverse law students interested in becoming prosecutors. One organization that I was involved with was the National Black Prosecutors Association, but there are others, including the Latino Prosecutors Association, the Asian American Prosecutors Association, and the National Asian Pacific Islander Prosecutors Association. In the end, diversity training and discussions on the role of diversity is only useful if there's follow-up and the ability to be in intimate spaces and have real, genuine dialogue. Too often, people want a Band-Aid fix on race, which is an issue that has been toxic for hundreds of years. If we want to increase diversity in these spaces, we must be intentional about it. Now, I've been on many diets in my life, and I've learned that healthy eating has to be managed. The same is true for bias and racism. It takes maintenance, not a quick fix. So, how did I respond to the accusation from my date that I wanted to put Black men in jail? I responded, no, of course not. Some people make bad choices. My focus is to prosecute crime. I want to help crime victims, including Black victims, while making a difference in my community and criminal justice. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So I think we have time for questions. If people have any, you can submit them in the chat. I'm actually happy to just have people talk as well. Is that okay, Gaspar? Elias?
Oh, well, that was the applause icon, but
I'm sorry, I thought it was the raise hand function.
it's okay.
No worries. So one question that I have, it's more of a comment, but I want to get your reflection on this, is at least in the circles that I run in, I do see a lot of the same kind of skepticism of prosecutor work or government work or anything of that sort. And one thing that I think is the motivator is a kind of sense that being involved with that apparatus is, in some sense, being
Complicit.
complicit with the worst things that that apparatus may do. And I kind of want to say, you know, suggested by your comments also, that, you know, avoiding the power of that apparatus, the power for it to do good, because you are, you know, don't want to be involved or something like that, is itself such a choice, right? That's a moral choice itself that carries, it carries, criticism as well, the potential for criticism. If you are avoiding, the kinds of responsibilities that you might have for the worst things because, you don't want to be involved, but then you can't do good. Well, that's a moral choice too. So I just want your reflections on something like that kind of thing, thinking.
Of course, I've heard that before where people feel like they'll be complicit, but I think people ignore all of the great work you can do as a prosecuting attorney. And they're also ignoring the importance and the value of having diverse people in the room where it happens. Because in the end, especially when we think about something like a case dismissal, I tell everyone in my criminal justice classes that I'm just as proud of the cases that I prosecuted and people got the punishment they deserved as the cases that I dismissed. And as a prosecutor, that was within my discretion, where defense attorneys would have to come asking and pleading for a dismissal. I got to make that call. And that in itself was tremendously powerful. I felt that I was making a difference every single day. Not to say that you don't make a difference as a defense attorney, not saying that defense work is not noble, important work. It is, but we need people on both sides. We do not want our criminal justice system looking where everyone is the same. We've got to have diversity in it. So I really want people to think about some of the good they can do. And, the truth of the matter is, if you don't like it, I've heard two stories. One is from Judge Belinda Hill, who was a phenomenal felony court judge in Harris County for several years before she retired. She thought she was going to do defense work. She had an opportunity to go to Harris County. She loved it. She never left until she was appointed to the bench. I have another friend who works for the public defender's office here in Harris County, who went to the DA's office, hated it, and just kind of, he said he felt dirty almost, and has never looked back and has done defense work. I have friends who have been career defense attorneys. In the end, you have to follow your call and your passion, but I don't want people to be so narrowly focused to think that the only way they can help is through defense work. That it's a hard job, and we need both sides.
Excellent. Gaspar, did you have a follow-up question?
I did, and I think, Professor, you've mentioned this kind of behind closed door when we were planning the event, but I was impressed, and I think this is useful information for students, especially who are a little afraid to take these public roles internships because they don't pay. So it's like there's almost a stigma in school, right? That, oh, you didn't get the big firm or medium-sized firm that's going to pay you and take you to the Astros games. You got the DA's office. And you mentioned there's resources and different things. So I think this is really important, especially students who are interested in criminal law. If you can share that with us.
Absolutely. You are so valuable by going into criminal law if for no other reason. You should go into it because you can make a difference in people's lives. But the trial experience, if you want to kind of bottom line that, you get a level of trial experience you can't get anywhere else. And that alone makes you really valuable. Now, it's true, I think that there is the notion or there's a tendency for civil attorneys to kind of look down on public service work and prosecutors. The truth is, they can't really do what we do. Right. There is so much involved with criminal justice. And a lot of times when they try to come over, they're out of their element. But attorneys, judges who've done criminal law, it's a much easier transition to go into civil work.
Professor Burnett?
Hey, thank you, Nasri. It was an outstanding presentation, and you really sparked my interest in what we might do while our students are still our students before they graduate. I love the idea of helping bridge the economic gap for career choices once they've graduated, but is there something more directive we could do while they're in school so that they have exposure to the prosecutor's office? I know Dean Dennis has a robust internship program, but experiencing it rather than seeing it on television or your community sense could be really impactful, I think, in a different way. What could we do in the schools?
I think when it comes to diverse perspectives, we need some more diverse prosecutors to talk to our students so they can have a different point of view. I think we have a wonderful internship program, but a lot of those students are going to be reticent about applying, right? So we need to continue to open those doors, not only for our local prosecutor's office, but the U.S. Attorney's Office as well. So we can be more educated in terms of the good that they do. And that's going to benefit not just our minority students, but all students. Because as I said, I love that people are excited about criminal justice reform, but I just want them to be open to different ways to accomplish it.
Kimberly McTorry?
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning. I am a former prosecutor myself, and I know earlier you mentioned the gratification that comes with protecting a victim of a crime as well as dismissing a case. And I know in my experience, oftentimes doing so may have been frowned upon or not as celebrated as getting a conviction with a high amount of jail time. And it was a part of the reason that ultimately I ended up leaving the DA's office, because sometimes it felt as if I was chipping away at a brick wall with a toothpick. What would you say to those minority prosecutors that are left to encourage them to continue?
I would, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I always tell my students, if I had better mentoring, I would still be a prosecutor. My goal was to be a career prosecutor, and I was going to die in that position because I felt so strongly in fighting for victims. But I had mentoring, but a different kind of mentoring would have really made a big difference. I know it's discouraging, but it also depends on where you go. Every DA's office has its own flavor, right? When I was a prosecutor, I felt very empowered to dismiss cases, and I felt no blowback, not ever. I never felt criticized for it. I never felt that it was a problem from my chief or the higher ups. But administrations change, right? And so you've got to be mindful of the culture of the office you're working in. And maybe just because that culture may not be as, I don't want to say toxic, that may be too strong, but maybe it's not as helpful in those matters. Look at other offices. I also want to encourage all of my students to remember Texas is not just Houston and San Antonio and Dallas and Austin. We are a combination of so many small towns, and we desperately need good, ethical people to go in those communities as well. So I would say find mentoring, be open to other avenues. And, I'll even say this. I remember vividly being a single woman as a prosecutor and lamenting with one of my very dear friends, who was also a Black female, saying, I'm so sick of seeing all these gorgeous Black men in orange jumpsuits. It is discouraging. So I understand the frustration and the discouragement. I also remember, crying and praying with my victims. I remember fighting for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. And it's that aspect that really helped motivate me.
Stephen Higginbotham?
Well, you sort of addressed my question to some extent, but I was wondering, like in criminal justice reform, sometimes you hear discussions about police culture and how that can be an impediment to progress. I was wondering to what extent you might feel that there's a culture within prosecutors' offices that's less about doing justice and more about getting convictions and getting the maximum penalty.
That is a real issue. Honestly, I did not feel that my conviction rates mattered, but there were other prosecutors who did. There are people who go into criminal justice, and I try to tell my students and turn them away from this, that treat this like this is a mock trial, a moot court competition, and it's a game. And we're really dealing with people's lives. So how do we change that culture? I think it starts at law school. We need to remind students that we're dealing with people's lives, and we owe it to every person who comes in that courtroom to treat them with dignity and respect. And I'm sure if you've done any work in criminal justice, you've seen people mistreated. You've seen people treated like numbers. It also starts from the top. So we need to encourage our elected prosecutors to have a culture that values justice. You know, even our code of criminal procedure in Texas, it says it's the duty of the prosecutor not to seek convictions, but to see that justice is done. I love that provision. I repeat it to my students every chance I get, but it needs to be really drawn into people in the DA's office as well. Now, of course, there were some times when I felt like the DA's office was like an old boys club, right? But it all depends on the top down leadership to change those things, some training, all of that I think can make an impact. Will you always have some people who are only thinking about numbers? Absolutely. It wasn't my experience that that was that big of a deal, and maybe I was naive. I can't help but think of Kelly Siegler, a well-known prosecutor who I have the utmost respect for. She was my misdemeanor deputy dog, and she used to share how she never won a misdemeanor case, lost all of them. But she became a well-known, very a prosecutor who won several cases. And in the end, we should be winning the cases if we're doing our job, right? If the grand jury does their job, if the police officers do their job, we should only be prosecuting cases where we are convinced that the person has actually committed the crime. I hope that answers you.
We just have a few minutes left, but I want to, I think we have a couple of questions. So Reed, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So, and I want to say thank you for mentioning the small towns in South. So I'm from a small town myself. I'm from a sleepy town in South Texas, and so you know, there's kind of a larger issue that no one really talks about because not a lot of people are from there. Is that the big cities are such a brain drain.
Mm.
And so, I mean, what do you think the solution is to fix that in our area?
Money. Right? That's how, I mean, when you think about the U.S. Attorney's Office is having the same problem in terms of getting federal prosecutors to go to the Valley, which I think is still considered part of the Southern District of Texas. You've got to somehow entice people. But also what's interesting is we'll have students who come from those communities that don't want to go back. And we need to encourage them. We need to encourage you. We need you to go back. We need you to make a difference. We need you to give back to that community. Even if you don't want to be there forever, the way that you can serve as a role model, the difference that you can make by returning to those communities is just tremendous.
Great. And we'll take our last question, Shruti.
Yeah, good morning. I was wondering what your thoughts were on, so I know that there are some offices that, DA offices that kind of give out bonuses, or a lot of them they promote based on conviction rates. And I mean, I personally think that it's perpetuating the problem, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think that is abhorrent. I really do. That was not my experience. It just wasn't my experience that they wanted you to have trial experience so you would be ready for felony court. But I was always taught that they didn't care about, you know, you won or lost. I don't know, you know, I'm not under the current administration. I don't know what's going on in all the DA's offices, but I think that's a horrible ethical violation that perpetuates the stereotype that all prosecutors are out to put people in jail. And that just shouldn't be. That's just awful. And don't go to a DA's office like that.
Well, this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much for these really brilliant thoughts. And thanks everyone for your really great participation. So with that, I think we can move on to our next set of speakers. But before that, please use your reactions to give Professor Rutledge a round of applause. Great. So our next speakers are Professor Jeffrey Korn and Sebastian Edwards. Professor Jeffrey Korn is the Gary A. Kuiper Distinguished Professor of National Security Law at South Texas College of Law. He had a long distinguished career in the military and is a leading expert in the law of armed conflict, national security law, criminal law, and criminal procedures. It's such a broad set of things. Sebastian Edwards is a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of Texas's Houston Division. Sebastian also had a long distinguished career in the military and served as a judge advocate in a plethora of roles. So they will speak about race, ethics, and the grand and pettit jury.
Sebastian, good morning. How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
Good to see you, my friend. We've
too.
never met in person, but we share a common bond as former JAG officers and former Screaming Eagles doing criminal justice in the military. And I think some of that experience will come through. Do you want to go first or you want me to go first?
I can certainly go first, if that's all right.
Okay. And good morning to everybody, especially all the students who I miss seeing routinely in the classroom.
All right.